was 1987, and Sarah had just started her freshman year at a university in Pennsylvania. Like many first-year students, she was excited but a little nervous about moving into the dorms. Her roommate, Beth, had already moved in, and the two quickly became friends. They had different schedules, with Beth usually staying out late studying or working on campus. Sarah, on the other hand, was an early bird, often getting to bed before Beth even came back from the library. One Friday night, Sarah decided to stay in, feeling unusually tired. Beth had gone to a party with some other students and wouldn't be back until late, so Sarah locked the door and settled into bed. Before long, she was fast asleep. Hours later, she woke up to the sound of soft shuffling in the room. Thinking it was Beth returning, she rolled over and looked at the clock, 3:45 a.m. The shuffling continued, and Sarah saw the outline of Beth's figure across the room, moving quietly in the darkness. Too tired to say anything, she rolled back over and drifted off to sleep again. The next morning, Sarah woke up to the sound of her alarm, groggy but feeling rested. Beth's bed was neatly made, but her side of the room looked untouched. Sarah assumed Beth had stayed out somewhere after the party. Later that day, while grabbing breakfast in the dining hall, she ran into a friend of Beth's from down the hall. Sarah casually mentioned Beth coming in late last night, and the friend looked confused. "Beth didn't come home last night," the friend said. "She crashed at our place after the party." Sarah felt a cold chill run down her spine. She distinctly remembered seeing someone in their dorm room, someone she thought was Beth. She brushed off the feeling, convincing herself that she must have been groggy and dreaming. But the unease stayed with her for the rest of the day. That night, Beth did return to the room, and the two of them chatted for a bit before Sarah brought up what had happened. "I could have sworn you came in last night," Sarah said. "I even saw you moving around in the room at 3 a.m. Beth looked at her, puzzled. "I wasn't here. I was at Jenny's all night." They both shrugged it off as a weird mix-up, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Over the next few nights, she continued to feel strange in their room, like she wasn't alone, even when Beth was gone. Then about a week later, something terrifying happened. It was another late night, and Sarah was once again alone in the dorm room. She had been reading a book for her literature class and, feeling drowsy, decided to turn off the lights and go to sleep. The moment she clicked off the lamp, the room was plunged into darkness and that same eerie feeling returned. She lay in bed, wide-eyed, listening for any noise in the room. After a few minutes she heard it, the soft shuffling sound again, coming from across the room. The hairs on her arms stood on end. She was sure now that someone or something was there with her. Heard the sound of breathing, heavy and uneven, right next to her bed. In a panic, she reached over and turned on the bedside lamp. The room was empty, but something was horribly wrong. The closet door, which had been closed when she went to bed, was now wide open. Sarah jumped out of bed and grabbed her phone. She called Beth, who was staying at a friend's place again, and told her what had just happened. Beth hurried back to the dorm, but by the time she arrived, there was nothing out of the ordinary. The closet was shut again, and the room looked perfectly normal. That night, they both slept with the lights on, too terrified to turn them off. The next morning, they reported the incident to campus security, who took their concerns seriously. After inspecting the room, they made a chilling discovery. One of the floorboards under Beth's bed was loose, and underneath it was a small crawl space that led to the building's maintenance tunnels. It seemed someone had been accessing their room through the tunnels for who knows how long. The thought of it made Sarah sick. Whoever had been moving around the room those nights could have been hiding in the crawl space, watching them, maybe even standing over them as they slept. The university sealed off the tunnels and put extra locks on the dorm room doors. But Sarah and Beth couldn't shake the feeling of being violated. They both ended up requesting room transfers and moved out of the dorms shortly afterward. To this day, Sarah doesn't know who or what was in that room with her. But every time she thinks about it, she can still hear the soft shuffling in the darkness, and the memory of those heavy breaths next to her bed haunts her, even all these years later. That story is based on real accounts that circulated around a few colleges in the late 1980s and 90s. Some people say it was an urban legend, but others swear it happened. Either way, the idea of someone secretly living in your space without your knowledge is enough to keep anyone up at night. So it all starts one dark October night on a small college campus in the Northeast. Students are prepping for Halloween weekend, which means costumes, parties, and of course, scary stories. But two freshmen, Lydia and Emily, aren't feeling it this year. They'd both had exams that day and just wanted a quiet night in their shared dorm room. Emily was planning to study, while Lydia wanted nothing more than to crash early and catch up on sleep. The dorm they lived in was a typical college building, aging brick walls with creaky floors and dimly lit hallways. Their room was on the 3rd floor, and it felt pretty isolated. The few other students on that floor were either out or partying, so they thought they'd have a peaceful night. By 11 p.m., Lydia had already fallen asleep, but Emily was still hunched over her desk with headphones on, listening to music and studying. It was around that time she noticed something odd. There was a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere in the room. She tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the wind, or maybe a tree branch scraping against the window. But as the minutes ticked by, it grew louder and more distinct, like something clawing, almost desperate. She got up to investigate, feeling slightly spooked but trying to keep her cool. As she scanned the room, she realized it was coming from the closet. She laughed, too, herself, thinking Lydia must have knocked something over earlier, and now it was just settling. Still, she opened the closet to check, finding nothing but their clothes and a pile of shoes. Shaking her head, she went back to her desk, trying to refocus on her work. But soon enough, the scratching started up again. This time, it was louder, more insistent, like someone or something was trying to get out. Emily's heart started pounding, and she debated whether she should wake Lydia, who was still peacefully asleep, or if she was just imagining things. But she'd barely touched Lydia's shoulder when suddenly their door burst open. Standing there, white as a sheet, and visibly shaking, was one of the resident assistants. "Girls," she said in a whisper, "lock the door right now. There's an intruder in the building." Emily was immediately alert, slamming the door shut and sliding the bolt. She turned to Lydia, who was starting to wake up, groggy and confused. Emily filled her in on what the RA had said, and they both sat there in silence, their ears straining for any sound. Outside, they could hear distant footsteps and voices, but they didn't dare open the door to investigate. After about half an hour, everything went quiet. Emily and Lydia were exhausted from the stress and the silence, so they lay down in their beds, both too scared to sleep, but too tired to stay awake. Emily had finally dozed off when she heard a faint voice. It was Lydia's, whispering from across the room. She could barely make it out, but it sounded like Lydia was repeating the same words over and over. Emily was confused and a little scared. She sat up in bed and squinted in the darkness, trying to see her friend. She could barely make it out, but it sounded like Lydia was repeating the same words over and over. Emily was confused and a little scared. She sat up in bed and squinted in the darkness, trying to see her friend. "Lydia?" she whispered. "Are you okay?" There was no response, just the faint sound of Lydia's voice muttering from the other side of the room. Emily finally got out of bed and walked over to Lydia's bunk. She reached out a hand and gently shook her friend's shoulder, but Lydia didn't react. That's when she noticed that Lydia's eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. Emily backed away, a chill crawling up her spine. It was as though Lydia was in some sort of trance, whispering over and over, "Don't look under the bed. Don't look under the bed." Her voice was hollow, as if it wasn't even her speaking. Emily couldn't help herself. Against every instinct in her body, she knelt down and peeked under the bed. What she saw made her blood run cold. There, lying on his stomach with wide, staring eyes and a twisted smile, was a man. His arms were stretched out, and his fingers were bloody, raw from scratching the floor. He looked directly at Emily, and in a low, chilling voice, he whispered, "Thanks for not looking earlier." Emily screamed, jumping back from the bed as fast as she could. The noise woke Lydia up fully, and she joined in the screaming when she saw the man crawling out from under her bed. They both bolted for the door, screaming down the hallway for help. Later, after campus security arrived, they discovered that the man had somehow snuck in through a fire escape and had been hiding under Lydia's bed, scratching at the floorboards, trying to mess with them. He was mentally unstable and had wandered into the building, finding their door unlocked when they'd gone to the bathroom earlier. But the most terrifying part, they found scratch marks under the bed, as if he'd been there long before that night, waiting, and the RA later admitted that she hadn't come to their room at all that night. No one knew who or what had warned them about the intruder. Ever since then, students in that dorm leave offerings of candy outside their doors, especially near Halloween, hoping the spirit of the roommate's last words will protect them from what might be hiding under their beds. Years ago, on a rainy October night, a student named Claire was pulling an all-nighter at the university library. It was midterm season, and she'd been cramming for weeks. Like many older colleges, the university had a grand Gothic-style library, complete with stone walls, tall windows, and high, vaulted ceilings. By day, it was bright and beautiful, but at night, the shadows stretched long, and the silence felt thick and heavy. On this particular night, Claire had picked a spot in the deepest corner of the library, where it was quieter, away from the study rooms. She was exhausted, running on nothing but coffee, but she needed to get through her notes before her chemistry exam the next morning. As the hours passed, the library emptied out. One by one, the other students packed up and left, until Claire was completely alone. She glanced at the old grandfather clock in the reading room, and her heart sank when she saw it was almost 2 a.m. The only sounds were the gentle hum of the lights and the occasional creak of the wooden bookshelves. Just as she was about to return to her notes, she heard a soft, sound footsteps. She looked up, expecting to see a librarian or maybe another student. But the library was empty. She shrugged it off, telling herself it was probably just her tired mind playing tricks. But then she heard it again, this time closer. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, like someone pacing just beyond the edge of the reading room. Claire's skin prickled. She told herself it was just the creaking of the old building, but something didn't feel right. She was about to stand up and move closer to the main desk when she heard it. A soft whisper. Shh. The sound was faint, almost like a breath, but unmistakable. Someone was in the library with her. She felt a chill run down her spine as she scanned the room, trying to find the source of the whisper. But there was no one there. She brushed it off, assuming it was the wind. But a few moments later the whisper came again, closer this time. Shh. Claire was now genuinely spooked. She decided it was time to leave and started packing up her things. As she grabbed her bag, the whispering voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't just a shh. It was a full sentence, soft but clear, echoing through the reading room. Don't go. Stay and study with me. Her hands froze. She felt her stomach drop. She looked around, scanning the room frantically, but there was no one there, just shadows. She forced herself to keep calm, convincing herself it was a joke, or that she was just overtired. But as she turned to leave, the old metal reading lamp on her desk flickered, casting the room in and out of darkness. When the light steadied again, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. In the chair across from her, on the opposite side of the table, was an open book. She could have sworn it hadn't been there a moment ago. She walked over, trying to be brave, and glanced at the open page. The book was a dusty old textbook, one she'd never seen before. The pages were yellowed and worn, as if it hadn't been touched in years. But what caught her eye was a single sentence written in bold letters across the page. "Tum still here." She backed away, her heart racing. It was definitely time to leave. She slung her bag over her shoulder, practically running out of the reading room, her footsteps echoing in the empty library. But as she made her way toward the exit, she heard the whisper again, louder and more insistent this time. "Don't leave me." Claire picked up her pace, refusing to look back. But as she reached the main doors, she felt something cold brush against her arm, like a freezing draft. She flinched and spun around, only to see the same book from the reading room now lying open the floor in front of her. This time, there was a different message on the page. In hastily scrawled handwriting, it read, "7 won't let you go." Panic surged through her, and she bolted for the door, pushing it open and stumbling out into the night. The cold air felt sharp and real, a relief from the eerie silence inside. She glanced back, expecting to see the empty library behind her, but instead, through the glass door, she saw a shadowy figure standing in the reading room, watching her. It was a young woman, with hollow eyes and a pale face. Her hair was long and dark, hanging over her shoulders, and she was dressed in an old-fashioned, worn-out sweater. The woman raised a hand and slowly pressed it against the glass, staring at Claire with a sorrowful expression. The library door clicked shut, and the figure disappeared. Claire never went back to the library at night after that. She learned later from a friend that there was a story behind the ghostly figure. Decades ago, a student had been found in the same reading room, slumped over her books, having passed away from exhaustion and stress during midterms. Some students claimed to have seen her ghost wandering the library late at night, always looking for someone to study with. From then on, Claire told everyone she knew to stay out of the library late at night, especially during midterms, and she wasn't the only one. Even now, students who stay in the library too long sometimes feel a cold touch on their arm, or hear a soft, whispering voice. And if they look closely enough, they might even find that dusty, forgotten textbook with the words, "I'm still here."